I'm Stephen Basgall. I'm a senior DevOps engineer with GoGoAir. We've been using Spinnaker since it was open sourced, and Asgard before that. We've written Jenkins stages, webhook stages, Echo integrations in order to extend Spinnaker for our business needs.
All right. So anytime if any of you guys have questions, please help me out by raising your hand and asking a question. But since we're talking about building for Spinnaker and doing integrations of Spinnaker, we can maybe dive in right into the topic of Cloud Driver. So I'm curious if, well, I mean, I guess Ethan, you can just share your thoughts, but it's more question addressed to the users. Do you guys use the Cloud Driver at all functionality in Spinnaker? And if so, then what deployment targets you deploy to? And what, if any, customizations you had to do?
I can try and answer that. At Capital One, we have many opinions as far as deployment tooling goes. Prior to Spinnaker, there has been significant investment in tooling such as Terraform, CloudFormation, template, as well as Python libraries like Both03. That being said, we want to integrate with such existing tooling with lesser effort or focus in kind of revamping the ecosystem, if you will. So as far as Cloud Driver goes, we really have not embraced its full potential, honestly speaking. Certainly, as the future is ahead of us in that space, so we definitely want to explore and invest further in its kind of strength in the Kubernetes driver capability. But certainly in current state, our implementation of Cloud Driver is really from a querying our cloud resources perspective. It has the necessary vehicle for us to identify what has been deployed in our cloud environment and to be able to articulate or annotate what's our assets or our footprints on the cloud.
Okay, well, I have a couple of follow-on questions to that, but maybe Steve, you can comment on it too.
We use AWS EC2 as our deployment target through Cloud Driver. We're doing it to eight AWS accounts right now. 16 VPCs roughly, so multi-region for each account. And then we have Cloud Driver set up with a read-only cluster and then the write clusters. And we have we've separated out by a small Cloud Driver cluster, each handling like 2 accounts split up, because the number of resources we had in each account was driving Cloud Driver's performance into the ground a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So then maybe a follow-on question to you guys, and then Ethan, hopefully you can comment from kind of like the vendor perspective.
Right.
So the reason why I asked about Cloud Driver to begin with is because one of the first things we did at Morantis when we were kind of exploring getting into Spinnaker is we went ahead and talked to a bunch of users, and we found a pattern of quite a few users not using the Cloud Driver, which in my opinion is kind of interesting because the core value of Spinnaker, as we saw it, is kind of in this marriage between the deployment target and the application deployment logic. And if you do away with the Cloud Driver and substitute something else, you just use the pipeline engine, which kind of makes Spinnaker a whole different beast. So I guess, Cam, the question to you is, why do you not use Cloud Driver, and what do you use instead? So how do you put, for Spinnaker to deploy, you have to actually provision an environment in AWS, I guess in your case, or anywhere else. So what do you use and who is responsible for doing that part?
Right, so as shared earlier, we had significant investment across our development community within Capital One on existing tool sets such as Terraform and CloudFormation templates and also libraries. So they weren't giving, our user, whom are the development teams, aren't giving up what they have invested so hard on just right off the bat. And to be able to sell to them, the cloud driver can simply replace what they have is an uphill battle. Honestly speaking, it also boils down to sort of like resource availability and what's on the bench strength, right? So generally speaking, the market is more acceptable and friendly to Terraform and Python scripting than a cloud driver niche development-wise goes. So there are some black box in the space of learning cloud driver implementation that is hard to argue against the general kind of users.
I got it, thank you. And Stephen, any comments from you on, I guess I know that you encounter some problems with Cloud Driver, right, as you mentioned. So I guess the question, API rate limiting. Okay, I got it. Okay, so now let me, I guess, switch the gears and ask Ethan. I know that you're probably like the community guy. So I go into Slack and I participate in some of the meetings, and you're one of the most active and most helpful people, I think, in the Spinnaker community today. So I'm curious, first of all, if this cloud driver thing that we're talking about here is more like a pattern, or if it's an isolated case, and more importantly, how do you see this whole situation evolving? Meaning, like, do you think that as Spinnaker becomes more mainstream, people will just forget the cloud driver altogether and just use existing tools like Terraform, or there's going to be some evolution to the cloud driver in Spinnaker that'll make it easier to plug in with some of the things that are there?
Yeah. So I think that cloud driver it has its place, and it does what it does well. I don't think that cloud driver could be seen kind of as a total replacement, because it does what it does for server groups and for actually like deploying those server groups. But I think that there's still a lot of room to be able to not only deploy like VMs and containers, but also be able to deploy more static infrastructure, I think. And I think that's where Terraform and CloudFormation come in. So I think if you want to look at it from the perspective of the project growing, that's one big area that can be focused on and grow. And even then, that may not be built directly in the cloud driver. It may be the case that that work is done somewhere else in some new service or some existing service. But I think that from a development perspective, that's kind of the beauty of Spinnaker, where we can abstract a lot of those tasks to any sub-service or new service or whatever we want to add, but the interface is still the same. You're still orchestrating all of these things with work, communicating kind of throughout the entire system.
Okay, thank you. All right, so maybe any cloud driver related comments or questions from the audience? I'm curious.
Question to Stephen. Did I pronounce your name right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so what kind of, how big are your accounts, and how did you solve your API rate limit problems?
We asked for an increase, is the short answer, but there are some things you can do with the cloud driver configuration to set rate limiting internally, and it's by specific API call. So that's really helpful. You can limit whatever the exact API that's getting limited. You can restrict that without necessarily blanket restricting every API calls. These are accounts with maybe 400 clusters, 300 clusters, around there. And then other things, other than your running infrastructure that cloud driver indexes, like your base images and things like that. I think we got to 40,000 base images at one point, and cloud driver would take 10 minutes to start. So we started making sure to clean those up. But a few little bumps in the road like that. So for rate limiting specifically, working with AWS to explain why we require an increase, and then using what's available in Cloud Driver to set limits on any of the API calls that are hitting the limit.
Question for Steve. Is there like any best practice in terms of architecture around Cloud Driver? Like, sometimes sometimes like if you budget like resources and stuff like that, we've kind of seen. Or what do you mean? Like so, as you know, as your environments grow, having it kind of like on a centralized system. You said you separated them out into readers and writers. Is that kind of like the best practices? Or?
Yeah, that's what was recommended to us when we got started. Initially, we had a read-only cluster and then the write cluster. Eventually, the performance linking that to so many different accounts was too slow, so we haven't broken it down to one-to-one, like one cloud driver per account. But that might be the next step.
So I'm interested to hear, you know, you mentioned that at Cap One, you're using Terraform and CloudFormation to actually roll stuff out, but you're using Spinnaker as kind of the single pane of glass, right, to show you what's actually out there. Since this is a panel about kind of developing on the platform, I'm interested to hear kind of two things. One, have you guys actually made any changes or extended Spinnaker in a way to support that internally in whatever you guys are doing in GoGo? But also, what kind of difficulty did you run into during that process, if any, for actually like extending the platform?
Yeah, good question. We did cross that such journey. In terms of rate limiting, we follow a similar pattern as that you did, Steve. We identified the kind of offending APIs and made some kind of fine-tuning around throttling such rate limiting situation. We're also considering how to kind of federate the number of instances and which accounts to be hooked up to. That's still an explorative journey. And then in terms of customization, we did have to add some additional endpoint calls to be able to, I'm not sure if recent changes have allowed this, but in our early kind of adoption, we had to enhance it to include calls to retrieve ECS clusters. Also, containers that are running on those clusters. So all the necessary attributes that comes along with ECS, we had to write on to know the better.
All right, so since the last thing on Cloud Driver, and then we'll move on somewhere else. I'm curious, in the audience of you guys, how many are actually users of Spinnaker? Do you work for an organization that is doing something with Spinnaker? Okay, so it's probably like 60–70% of you. Okay, and of you guys, how many are using Cloud Driver versus how many are using something else like Cap One? Raise your hand if you're using Cloud Driver. So it's most people. Okay, got it. Okay, interesting. All right, so then I guess we'll move on from this topic a little bit. We kind of dove really deep into very specific things, so we'll kind of up level a little bit and talk about developing for the platform pluggability and maybe some of the enhancements that you guys are working on. So I know there is one of the kind of core tenets for any CT solution, and Spinnaker specifically, is this pluggability with the other components that are in SDLC within an enterprise, and possibly the deployment plugins like the Cloud Driver is one manifestation of it. So when we started digging a little bit under the cover, what we realized is that today, across many areas of Spinnaker, like Cloud Driver, for instance, there isn't really a very straightforward path for writing plugins, such as modifying Cloud Driver or writing like a new version of Cloud Driver that can work, for instance, with OpenStack. So writing a plugin requires you to know pretty much all of the components, and it's basically about forking the code, changing a bunch of stuff, merging it back in. And I'm curious what you guys think about it in terms of going forward trends and the importance of changing that and introducing more of a repeatable plugin mechanisms around certain areas, such as Cloud Driver. It matters, doesn't matter, should community focus on it, maybe it's, you know.
So I guess we'll start with you.
Yeah. So this is actually something I've kind of thought about a lot over the last year. Kind of, first off, you know, I think you have a couple options. I think first off, you can extend Spinnaker. You can kind of what Armory does is we do what kind of Netflix does already, and we extend it. We layer our functionality in. We don't go as far as like adding a new cloud provider to CloudDriver, but that's one option you have. I also think that one of the really interesting things about the Spinnaker platform and the architecture is that it's just microservices, and so as long as you understand the contract that the service that you're trying to modify or interact with, as long as you understand that contract, then you can kind of fake it, right? Or you can actually, I think there's a real possibility to actually implement your cloud provider in some other language or some other API, some other service, and then have a routing layer on top, right? So you say if it's going to cloud provider, like the Terraform cloud provider or something, you just have a routing layer and route it to a different service. So you're still talking, you may be still talking to the CloudDriver URL, but what you're doing really is talking to a proxy that goes off to another service, and then everything else can go to CloudDriver. But you talked about plugins. I think what we've seen is the Jenkins community has seen a lot of success with plugins, but I think that the story around plugins and defining what that looks like in our community, in our project, there's still a lot of conversation to be had around
At Capital One, we are definitely a little bit conservative in our experimentation of the CloudDriver. We have, though, taken much further along our evolution with the other layers, that of Igor, Orca, and Front 50. Significant change, add-ons to Front 50 as we have backends that provide additional capability that we needed to fold in, Igor inclusive. Front 50, particularly, we enable a much more robust I/O per se in runtime data of the pipeline execution. And Igor, we extended to include a GitHub API integration. I touched upon GitHub API integration because in terms of enabling a control environment and a kind of bidirectional sync between of a declarative pipeline implementation to where we're actually storing the equivalents. So having GitHub serving as our source control and the rendering of the pipeline is actually fetching from GitHub. And so any update to the UI for your pipeline also gets kind of pushed back to GitHub. And so we have this kind of audit trail in a sense, leveraging the platform that is good for providing such needs to be able to have a kind of like a collaboration model, peer review process to enable a declarative pipeline development model. And various things on top of Igor integration also includes hooked into kind of Jenkins, so and possibly other CI platform as well. But much of the kind of legacy implementation and investment has been on Jenkins. So being able to extend Igor to have a full coverage of all that you can already implement on Jenkins is definitely one of our core value proposition in enabling a reuse capability.
At GoGo, we haven't done any modifications to CloudDriver directly, or even really considered it. And I
How
think
about other parts of Spinnaker? Anything else?
yeah. Well, I was going to mention, we, like most people, have a need for Terraform, CloudFormation, especially managers really want to see something like that. What we ended up doing was deploying an EC2 instance that triggers off an S3 bucket notification, and we drop a CloudFormation template in that S3 bucket, and this instance applies it. So we don't get the infrastructure view, we don't get some of the other value adds of Spinnaker, but we do still get our pipeline stages for things like change management, those kinds of things for GoGo's business. It's still going to go through those pipeline stages. So that's something that we did to work around it.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody from the audience? Anybody want to volunteer any interesting modifications you've done to Spinnaker or any plugins that you wrote and what your experience was? Has anybody written anything?
I broke it once.
Okay.
But I fixed it afterwards.
Well, I guess the reason I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this topic is I feel that in general, a clean kind of a plugin development mechanism is very important, especially when it comes to trying to build like a bigger community. And if you are, dealing with a project where you have to understand all components, all dependencies, and potentially be changing some of the core stuff to, for example, attach like a new cloud resource, it does stifle adoption, and it's not good for the community. So, yes, my comment. And I personally think that should be a focus for Spinnaker going forward, as it evolves beyond being just a tool that is used by a few limited vendors to a tool that is used broadly and developed against broadly. I guess maybe let's try to shift gears a little bit and talk about maybe Spinnaker deployment. So there's multiple ways to do deployment now. Halyard is a prescribed way. So one comment I can make from myself, Halyard related, and I'd like to see what your thoughts are on it, is we found that on one hand it's definitely the most mature and developed way to do lifecycle management for Spinnaker, but what we've also found is that a lot of people that have to manage Spinnaker in a typical organization don't manage just Spinnaker. They manage other things. And Halyard is a very kind of a, it's a Spinnaker-specific opinionated thing that does a great job managing Spinnaker, but you have to, again, kind of learn all of the Halyard primitives to do that. And I know that the prescribed approach in the community is to kind of stick with Halyard, but, the rest of the world is, oftentimes using a different approach. So I'm curious what you guys' thoughts are, if you use Halyard to begin with, and again, how you think if you were to project 5 years out and imagine Spinnaker community of there's like 5,000 people at the summit, is everybody going to be just using Halyard, or is it going to evolve in some way?
I can start.
Okay.
We have not kind of taken the journey to explore into leveraging Halyard. More particularly because we've invested in Terraform and Ansible. And so Terraform is being leveraged to provision on AWS, just to have a kind of backdrop to that. So Terraform is leveraged to provision or stand up the ASG, the service group, and Ansible essentially doing any frying on top of the initialization. So frying-wise goes being able to token replace any configuration that is environment specific. But certainly when we bake our RPM, it has everything that is needed by our Ansible to be able to kind of do a bootstrapping. And of course, the ability to leverage Terraform is really via a kind of CLI model. And so our deployment of Spinnaker is very much in itself CLI driven, and to be able to be almost platform agnostic in that sense of deployment, other than the fact that it is Terraform.
Yeah. So, to your point about kind of how you're being the prescribed way of managing the lifecycle of Spinnaker, I think there's really there's two aspects of how you're. So the first one is managing the lifecycle of Spinnaker. It's managing how those services get rotated, how they actually get into Kubernetes or onto the machine that they're deploying to. But there's also, what I think one of the biggest advantages, and this anyone I think can take advantage of this, is the fact that it's a configuration manager and a configuration generator, if you will. And one of the problems that we had a couple years ago was like there's so much Spinnaker configuration that communicating that and telling everyone, hey, you can configure this and this is how you do it, was extremely difficult. And there were a lot of times where you had one specific configuration. In order to take advantage of that, you had to change something in a different area. And so one of the things that Halyard does is it codifies a lot of those, what I like to call tribal knowledge, the knowledge that comes with working on the platform to make it more accessible. So I think that there's opportunity for the Cap Ones and the Go-Go's who are not using Halyard today to still take advantage of some of the offerings, which is getting the configuration right, and then you deploy services the way you prefer.
At GoGo, we started out building images with Ansible and then deploying them with Terraform for our Spinnaker infrastructure. Currently, we deploy Spinnaker services through Spinnaker. That may not be for everyone. But we've had good success with it. We haven't encountered a situation where that has caused an issue with us. We do have a test environment to kind of vet things first before we do that. And like you said, we do use Halyard to print out new configuration files and to understand what the bill of materials is for Spinnaker releases. It's a good source of truth for that information. So as we upgrade services, often we'll go and look at changes to the Halyard configuration output to see what new parameters may have come out in that version, what new configuration options are there, because there isn't, right now that's probably the easiest, most accessible source of that information is Halyard printing configuration files.
I got it, thank you. And as far as the audience is concerned, can you raise your hand if you use Halyard? Can you raise your hand if you use something else? So it's 50-50. Okay. I got it. Any comments or questions from the audience on the kind of prescribed way of deploying Spinnaker? Okay, a bunch of questions. Okay, well, maybe let's start over there.
Does anyone do custom versions? It sounds like you don't modify the code, but at Snapchat we have to modify certain pieces of Spinnaker to make it work in our infrastructure. So I don't know if anyone had encountered keeping in tune with the release cycle and also patching your patches.
Yeah, so that's actually something we do at Armory. So we actually recently just started extending Halyard because we have a couple services that we deploy that are like auxiliary to Spinnaker, and we deploy those through Halyard. So we actually have a custom bill of materials that we host that Halyard takes advantage of. We actually added a configuration option to point at our specific bucket. But essentially what we do is we base our releases on stable releases, and then we layer our patches or our extensions on top of that. And then we distribute the custom bill of materials with that point to a different Docker registry with our custom builds on it.
Some questions, yeah?
So I think the intention would be, because we do the same thing, and what we do is we'll add extension points in Spinnaker for the cases that we need to differ things in our environment, and we'll upstream those. Because yeah, we do our own custom packages for everything. We drop plugins in there, we change UIs, we do everything possible with Spinnaker. And whenever I get into a situation where we're having to port patches around, we're having to contain more unique code than is necessary. So if there are situations where you think this would be a nice extension point because I need to plug in some different behavior, happy to have a chat about that, as you might know.
Over there?
I can answer briefly. At Google, we're trying to improve the build process for custom builds of Spinnaker as well, especially with layered builds, because our internal use has a bunch of additions to CloudDriver, which we can't open source, And our build process is very different for internal Spinnaker than it is for open source Spinnaker. We're trying to reify that to make that one process.
Yeah, would like to learn how Heliard can be used to build your customized code of Spinnaker and use requirements of Spinnaker.
So it's a question, how to use Heliard to deploy Spinnaker? Or how to manage configuration with Heliard?
How we can use Heliard to manage or deploy custom versions of Spinnaker?
Yeah, I can touch on that. So the Halyard, kind of the core of it is like the bill of materials, right? And that tells you what your version is. So it says I'm going to use this version of Gate, this version of CloudDriver, everything. So without kind of extending it for any custom services you have, you actually have the ability to change what that bill of materials is. So if you have a custom extension of CloudDriver, all you need to do is update the version. And like for us, we do Docker images, so we just specify our Armory Docker registry, and then we distribute that to our customers. So in much the same way, if you have to extend CloudDriver or Gate, you can also extend Halyard and provide like a custom build where, so for us, we had a service that we had to add, so we added it. We basically filled in all the blanks, right? So we made sure that it was deployed in the same way. The code was the same for other services. Then we just added that to our bill of materials. And then whenever it's enabled, we can turn it on. So I'd be happy to talk to you a little bit more afterward and show you kind of what we're doing.
I've also seen like Heliard follows a different version scheme than GitHub. So how do you manage like what is what?
I'm going to pass that one off to either Lars or Jake. We were sitting in the back.
So they're versioned independently because we want to not require you to upgrade Halyard every time you upgrade Spinnaker. There are times though, for example, in the upcoming release, there is a config property change introduced by a community member which breaks existing configuration of Spinnaker, but Halyard's aware of that and upgrades itself to get to the latest version. So in the bill of materials, there's a top-level versions tracking component which says, for this version of Spinnaker, you need at least this version of Halyard, but most of the time you actually don't have to upgrade to avoid that hassle.
Oh, yeah. One more comment there.
Well, just looking at like securing our deployment of Spinnaker and looking at probably the origins of it, like it seems that it used to be separate fleets, most likely on separate instance groups, and now it's all the eggs in the same basket on the same Kubernetes cluster. Like what's it might just be me being too new to it, but it's like what's the thinking in terms of spreading it in trust zones so that, for instance, Deck is not hosted with CloudDriver or things like that, because that doesn't make me feel super good when I look at it.
You guys can bring it in. Don't want to take over.
Is what you're trying to do separate different components of Spinnaker into different networks?
Essentially, I would like it done to use no long-term credentials, so I would like to not rely on the Kubernetes secrets, which are super hard to, which are not really the best thing to rotate the secrets, and that are also accessible from anywhere within the same Kubernetes cluster. So essentially rely more on ambient credentials from the cloud provider, either GCP or AWS, either side.
Sure. Are you talking for user logins or API access to Gate?
I would like, for instance, if Deck gets compromised, that it doesn't have the same access level at the node level than CloudDriver. Even if it's on the same Kubernetes cluster. I'm just looking at threat.
I can speak to that from an AWS perspective, and hopefully that's helpful. The only, other than accessing S3 storage or something like that, the only service that needs IAM privileges is CloudDriver. So you would give CloudDriver specific access to AWS IAM, and none of the other services need it at all, except if they use S3 as a storage backend, for example, for their own information. Maybe from a Kubernetes perspective, someone could help me out here.
So, just so I kind of understand, it's more of a, if one of the particular services is compromised, you basically don't want all the dominoes to fall, right? You just kind of.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so if a deck is compromised, you don't want to, somebody to have the same access to CloudDriver, right?
Yeah.
I guess I would kind of ask, how would you do that for like your internal application?
So for my internal application, so actually if I don't necessarily rely on the Kubernetes model, I would have deck on one instance group with one instance role, or service account if you're on GCP, either way, that can only do the storage. And then I would have CloudDriver be with the rest of the permissions on a separate fleet that has that also MVC and completely bypass Kubernetes.
Okay. Yeah, so I think the answer to your question is cube to IAM. So you could use, are you shaking?
Yeah, from what I've looked at, it still relies on you have no node level compromise in your cluster. The moment you got a node level compromise in your cluster, I think the assumptions of that won't break. But I would have to work more on it.
Maybe. Lars?
I think it's also a shortcoming in Kubernetes where you really don't have pod level security policy apply very nicely. It's not necessarily, I mean, Spinnaker ideally shouldn't require every pod to have the same access level, and it doesn't, but it's the fact that you're running it in Kubernetes that makes it so.
Right.
I mean, you can run CloudDriver in a separate cluster that has separate permissions. It's just a matter of setting up those service endpoints like correctly so they talk across the cluster boundary.
Right.
So really, I think the Kubernetes team actually does have some proposal for better IAM integration, so when you're running on a certain pod, regardless of what node you're scheduled on, only that pod has permission to do certain environment-based authorization.
There's that possibility.
So we have, I think, like 5 minutes left before we have to break, but I wanted to touch one more point that kind of is close to my heart, and that is actually like the self-service functionality, or like the ability, like if I'm a development team and I want to go ahead and add like a new Kubernetes cluster that I, for instance, like instantiated in a GKE or something like this. From what I understand, there isn't really a way to do it other than go to the ops team and tell them to like put in the credentials and then basically reboot Spinnaker so they can pick up a new configuration, which is not ideal, and I think that community is aware of it, but I'm curious if you guys have the same problem, and maybe Ethan, if you can comment on what's happening as far as the different options for solving that.
So the answer may not be specific to, say, Kubernetes, but in general, say, if you want to bolt on a new CloudDriver instance, for example, right? Whether it's something that you want to do to hot deploy or needing a cold reboot. In my humble opinion, I tend to believe that to avoid rate limiting Spinnaker itself, you have to provide some level of oversight, and that is to observe what is being added on and to ensure that you have some opportunity to evaluate what it's going to do to the rest of the ecosystem, right? What if you add on this new account, this additional cluster, what additional capacity is going to be demanded upon the core Spinnaker instance to understand what type of additional call, what traffic is going to be introduced between Spinnaker and this new cluster, and to evaluate whether you have to scale up or tune your auto-scaling capability as well. So that's my belief. And it's just like adding on a new CloudDriver instance, you have to understand what its impact to your existing traffic or your existing capacity.
I'm not talking about adding something dramatic like CloudDriver. I'm talking about like adding a new cloud account. Like I have a new, account and set of credentials to log in a new pool of, EC2 instances, for instance.
Right. But to some degree, you're still opening up the network and you're still introducing additional traffic flow.
So the answer, I guess, is that that's like a design decision, and that is something that is actually one of the best practices that should stay, is what I'm hearing, in your view, which, I mean, is...
In my humble opinion, that
Yeah.
would be a
Okay.
fair assumption.
We actually have an open proposal in the community to add this concept of an account manager, which would take like a GKE credential, for example, and then every time a cluster arrives, add a new account on your behalf, and then when one's deleted, delete the account and all of its resources in Spinnaker. Because really, like the account concept mapped over well from AWS to GCE, but for more fungible environments and places where you can really quickly spin up Kubernetes clusters, it doesn't make so much sense to have to go in and reboot CloudDriver every time you make a change. So if we implement that, we still have some open questions, we'll shop it around. That should really make this pain point go away.
Okay, thank you. Any final thoughts or comments or questions on this topic before we close? Anybody?
I vote yes on that.
Ratified.
I think even in the AWS world, account factories and ephemeral accounts and deployment accounts are things that are being investigated now. So those kind of features will be wanted even for an AWS provider by some organizations, I think.
Exactly, yeah.
Right now, since we deploy Spinnaker with Spinnaker, it's pretty easy. We can just change the config and click deploy everything and come back a little later and it's done. It's not a lot of actual work, but that isn't a good design still, probably. That's not the ultimate pinnacle of what can be done.
Okay, all right, well, thank you everyone. I think that we can keep going forever, but I think we're out of time, so thanks everyone.